Hello, everyone. It's really good to see faces. If folks are able to turn their cameras on, we would love to see you. We also understand you may be in a situation where you cannot turn on your camera, and that's okay. I'm Andy Engel, and I want to welcome you to this final session of the series, The Wisdom of Grieving Parents, Living with Loss and Love. I lead virtual public programs here at Reimagine. For those who may not know, Reimagine is a nonprofit organization catalyzing a uniquely powerful community. Um, People of different ages, people of different backgrounds, people of different ethnicities, people of different gender identities, sexual orientations, people of faith, people of no faith, all coming together to support each other in facing adversity, loss, and mortality, and to transform life's biggest challenges into action and growth. Reimagine resources, support groups. Events like this one today are free, sliding scale, and accessible to the public. This is made possible by the support and generosity of people like you. So for those of you who already made a tax-deductible donation to Reimagine when you registered, thank you. Your gift will immediately support Reimagine's mission to help people of all walks of life transform the hard parts into purpose and meaning. Last week, those who gathered with us participated in a workshop focused on our grieving bodies. And many of you who were in attendance are bereaved parents who lost their children to suicide, to addiction, to drunk drivers, to fentanyl, to disease, and other causes. We welcome those of you who have returned today, and we welcome new folks. I want to stress that this series is for you, and it's also for all of you who are friends, family, and colleagues of bereaved parents. Those of you who want to improve your grief literacy. How do I show up? What can I do? What should I say? Today, our main focus is action. What are the small, sweet steps we can take to learn, to transform, and perhaps to grow? Our special guest, who I'll introduce shortly, will be in conversation for about 35 minutes. We'll have 15 minutes after that of time for Q&A. So as you listen to our speakers, if questions come up, please use the chat to ask your question. I'll field those to our speakers as we get to that part of the program. And then after Q&A, we'll invite you to enter peer-led, prompt-driven breakout rooms. And you'll be in those rooms for about 20 minutes, and then we'll conclude. I want to thank two organizations that have hosted tonight's gathering, Emotion and Evermore. You can view the recordings of these two previous sessions with the link that my colleague Nicole Tan is going to share in the chat. Feel free to send me or Nicole a note if you're having any technical issues. We might be able to help you. We are recording parts of this program, and everyone who has registered will get a follow-up email with links, resources, and the link to the recording. Okay. At last week's workshop, with the help of Dion C. Monsanto and Myra Sack, we breathed together. We went on a virtual walk in places where we felt most connected to our children and our loved ones. And we also wrote 6-word memoirs of hope and heaviness. And I want to share a few of those in the chat that we collected. Nicole's going to paste those. And at any time in this session, if you're feeling inspired to share a 6-word memoir of hope or heaviness, feel free. Myra Sack is here with us at this session too. And I just want to invite you in, Myra. Thank you again for leading that beautiful session. What was most memorable for you last week? Myra, are you able to unmute? Hold on
Now
one
I am.
second.
I've just been given permission. Hi, Andy. Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Hi, Dr. Joe. Hi, Joyal. It's been a real honor to meet some of you throughout this series. For those of you who were with us last week, I think what was most powerful was just the capacity of our imaginations, our consciousness to take us to the most painful places and also the most beautiful ones, and how open and vulnerable this community was. Um, and is. So thank you for allowing me to be a part of it. Thank you, Andy and Reimagine. So enjoy this incredible conversation.
Thank you, Myra. Um, just a bit about our speakers before we get started. I encourage you to read their full bios in the event description, um, along with Myra. My conversations with Joyal Mulheron and Dr. Joanne Cacciatore were critical in shaping this series. Um, Joyal Mulheron is the executive director of Evermore, an organization she founded to change policy, advance research, and improve the lives of all bereaved people. She's had a decades-long career advising politicians on public policy. Um, she has a background in biotechnology. She's not only passionate about science and research, but she also loves art and creativity. Evermore is the only nonprofit I know that has a poet laureate. So kudos to you, Joyal. Dr. Joanne Cacciatore is one of the world's experts in traumatic loss and grief. You may have read her award-winning best-selling book, Bearing the Unbearable. She's a professor at Arizona State University. She's an ordained Zen priest who teaches meditation, mindfulness, compassion, and nonviolence. She's the founder of the Miss Foundation, an international NGO that serves families whose children have died. And she's the founder of the Sella Care Farm, a sustainable restorative community that provides aid to anyone suffering traumatic grief. So Dr. Joe and Joyal, um, I'm going to let the two of you continue on your own, but I want to begin by letting folks know, if they don't already, that you are both parents of daughters who died as infants. And I want to dedicate tonight's program to your girls, Cheyenne and Eleonora. May their memories be a blessing, and their legacies are blessings too, in terms of your work as advocates for other grieving folks. I want to stress that this gathering to take action is about small steps to move through grief and not move on from grief. Dr. Joe and Joyal, your achievements are amazing. I don't want to play that down. But today we're emphasizing the smaller steps that all of us can take to move through grief, not bypassing it, but facing it and then finding new pathways. So here's my question to kick this off to the two of you. Within the year after your daughters died, was there a particular moment when you felt like you were finally taking action for yourself? Maybe it was an act of self-compassion. Um, Maybe it was letting someone know your needs. Maybe it was about setting a boundary.
Joanne, do you want to start?
I sure can. There were lots of small steps. I mean, even from, first of all, welcome everyone. And thank you, Andy, for recognizing Eleonora and Shai, of course. And I'm sorry that everyone has to be here. That's all there is to it. Wish we were talking about something else. There were many things that I did in terms of little steps, and the very first moment was when I realized that a lot of trite sayings that people tried to comfort me with were not my truth. And so I got very good at those three words. Thank you for sharing. That's not my truth. Because people have all kinds of platitudes like, oh, at least it wasn't your older one who died. I'm sure you heard some of these, Joyal. God needed an angel to tend his garden. Everything happens for a reason. And once I learned how to, like we talk about in yoga, with a strong back, soft belly, push back a little bit, I was taking some of my power back. So that was one little tiny thing that I was able to do, to take a step toward taking care of not just myself, but my daughter, my child who died. What about you, Joyal?
Well, first, just to echo what you've said and the thanks and the appreciation just to be here. And I'm so honored that you even recognized my daughter. Thank you. I am not usually in venues where that's done, so it feels it feels very loving. So thank you for doing that. You know, I I don't know that I was as organized, Joanne. I remember the day that she died, actually, I took my dog for a walk later in the day. Um, and this woman was walking behind me, and I was just walking really, really slow. And she called me a bitch, and told me to get out of the way. And I just remember, like, in this moment, I just how callous and hard it was to be in the world. Not just even that day, but even that first, I mean, it wasn't just the first year, right? I mean, it's so much longer than that. And through a confluence of events, so our daughter's life played out sort of in our home. So every, room had a memory. The holidays were coming. I was not doing well. And I also really had this perspective, whether healthy or not, that I had failed. Like somehow, if I had just done something differently, she wouldn't have died. And so, I'm in the house. My employer had forced my resignation, while she was dying. Um, so even being in the house was not really a great place for me. And I was spiraling. And so, through a confluence of events, not of my own doing, I ended up taking a job to advise a former White House. And it turned out to be exactly what I needed because I both couldn't be in the world. I couldn't push back on people. I was almost sort of paralyzed. But if I went to work, I worked in this little bubble that was so intense and so fast paced that I didn't have time to address everything that was going on around me. And for me, that was safety and it was protection. It's not what I would recommend for other people. It's to know your own bandwidths and your own strengths and weaknesses and what you need to get through. Um, but my goal was to try to get to work every day when I was supposed to be there and remember to get my kids from school or to try to keep food in the house. It was just very practical. It was less engaging around our daughter's death and sort of the experiences associated with that. Joanne, I mean, from your perspective, I'm not a therapist. I am, more working on public policy, systems change, but you on a day-to-day basis, you are interfacing with families and people who are just in these profoundly vulnerable and sensitive moments. How do you approach that? How do you approach people in these just very sensitive times where just almost any external force can become victimizing, if not traumatizing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably one of the top three problems, if you will, that people who have traumatic grief bring to us at the Sella Care Farm is the way that the world is treating them. And that feeling of being very vulnerable and in a way kind of trying to avoid as much as they can in the world these emotional landmines that others set for them, with the lack of compassion and understanding around grief in general. And so, one of the very first questions I end up discussing with many of the people with whom I've worked is, how has your support been? And unfortunately, most often the support has not been at a level of acceptable in our culture. and in many cultures, to be frank. Grief is scary, especially when we're talking about children of any age dying. It scares people because they have their own children and they don't want to confront the reality that a child can die. And so in that space, you end up with people who are others who are around grieving people who are really avoidant. So they avoid grief and griever alike. And that doesn't give grievers a safe place to land in the world, right, Joyelle? I mean, I'm shocked that someone walking behind you would say that to you, and yet I'm not. You know, we don't live in a. I think it was Lawrence Durrell who said, you know, within every one of us is a small child screaming at the lack of tenderness in the world, and that's a thing. And when you're very vulnerable, it's a thing that stings even more, right?
Do you feel, so I know for me, and I don't usually talk about this publicly, but in those early years, so I cried every day to and from work for at least 18 months. And then I came home at night, which I still had to work and sometimes had 6:30 a.m. conference calls and all, it's all the things that you might imagine. But I also started to drink more alcohol because I felt like I had to almost numb myself from all of the things that I felt were happening around me. Do you see that in your own work, or did you have experiences like that in the beginning?
Yeah. I did not, but I'm not a substance person. I don't drink alcohol even socially, but I see it a lot in practice. Not it's alcohol, but it's also other distractions. I mean, alcohol happens to be, more readily accessible, but it's shopping, it's food, it's overworking. I might be a tad bit of an overworker. Um, so it's anything that it could even be spiritual practice, it could even be yoga for that matter. It's anything that calls us out of the experience of feeling our own legitimate, honest pain. Can actually be kind of a roadblock for us in terms of processing grief. And also, we live in a world that's so avoidant anyway and promotes these distractions because they push what I call, of course, the happiness cult. They want us to feel better. They want us to be happy. They want us to move on. It's time to move on. You may have heard this. Eleanor wouldn't want you to be sad, right? As if they know what Eleanor would want for you, right? And so these kinds of we call them social constraints in the literature. These kinds of social constraints really actually they're not neutral. They actually do active harm to people because those messages of be better, feel better get internalized. And I think they can actually be a barrier to transcension or transfiguration. I think it can be a barrier to whatever meaning might come from this, even if it's just doing something kind for your neighbor, because you realize things before. Because when your child dies, you realize things that you didn't realize about the world, right? I'm sure all of you have had that experience, this perspective shift, and you see suffering in the world more. And so many of us try to just abate a little bit of suffering in the world, and that kind of acrimonious tension with grief, I think, can actually be a barrier for people from that experience. So really, I think society's to blame, Joyelle. Do you think? I mean,
Well, yes. I mean, that is the work that I do, right? Is to shift the systems because I think we have the outcomes that we have today from the systems that we've built. But I wonder, Joanne, just sort of, I didn't have the good fortune of being in your orbit years ago when I was in a dark place. What would you recommend? Like if you today could talk to me years ago when I'm gonna just have one more drink tonight and whatever. What would you say to me in that moment today that might help me reorient?
Well, we didn't talk about that question, but that's a really good one, Joyelle. I think for me, it's not as much as talking to you about it as it is about just being with you and helping you carry the load. Because I think you do build emotional muscles, but we need people to bear witness. We need others around us to help us carry it until we build the muscles so that we can carry it ourselves. And I just don't see it enough. I do see it occasionally. Occasionally I get someone who's like, wow, I just had so much support. And I'm frankly, I'm always surprised by it, but pleasantly surprised by it, because I do see a difference in the way people cope when they've had really good social support, and the data support that. Everything in the literature supports that. So, I mean, in terms of taking that, what Andy calls that small, sweet step toward self-care or toward transfiguration or toward a little bit of meaning or purpose in life or a little crumb of something, you know, I think when we have good support and people willing to stay with us and bear witness, I think it's a little easier to find that. But when people avert their gaze, if the messages, even if it's intimated, if the messages from others are, oh, this is too painful for you to feel, just kind of move on and distract yourself, then we begin even unconsciously to internalize, oh, that's too painful, I have to distract. We live in a world that's completely distracting anyway. So for sure, when it's something so awful that people don't want to really hear about it, you don't get invited to a lot of parties in the year after your child dies. You know, it can be really hard. So I guess I wouldn't have said much to encourage you. I'm not much of a cheerleader, but I would have sat with you and poured over photographs and videos of Eleonora and helped you build the emotional muscles and cried with you and, you know, done all the things that I wish someone had been able to do for me, which I was never able to find. Right.
Yeah.
That's all I really needed. Someone to just bear witness. Right.
Yeah. You know, and it all just strikes me. I think this is worth sharing. When Andy reached out to us to participate in this, you know, sort of take action approach, I, you know, was very hesitant, because I also feel that you and I set a bar for taking action that I just don't think is realistic. And I think any notion that you have to go out and, you know, do the things that either of us have done, you know, when, as I said, you know, for me, for a while, it was, you know, just remember that I didn't leave my other kids other places, or, you know, there was a lot between here and there. So I also think there's this perception between, you know, the things that we're doing and the glean and sort of the sparkle of it, but not necessarily being able to see behind the curtain the road to get here. And so, I mean, with that being said, how did you get here? And I'm sure it's not, you know, the yellow brick road, at least it wasn't for me. And, you know, to, I guess, provide some context and perspective for the folks that are joining us today, that, you know, starting the farm, for example, or all the work that you've done. I mean, it's incredibly decorated and distinguished. What were sort of milestones along the way, or like, how did you get here? How did you go from that moment where Shai died to here today?
You know, I don't know if you saw that article that I sent you, but basically it suggested that it was an article on, they call it post-traumatic growth. Those of you who don't know, the research term is called post-traumatic growth. And there was a research study that showed that people who scored higher on grief measures, so the more intense their grief was, the more likely they were to score higher on post-traumatic growth measures. And so I think, yes, of course, there are ridiculous amounts of work that some people can invest, and not everybody wants to or has the time to do that. But I think I really do believe that old saying that to help one person is to help the world.
Yeah.
And that's where I really started, was the Kindness Project. I just started doing anonymous things in the community for one person at a time. I took the money. I was poor. I was a young mom. I was 29 years old. And I took the money that should have been hers and just started doing nice things for people anonymously in the community. And that was enough. That had to be enough, because that's all the energy that I had. And if that's all we can do, that's everything. That's the world. That is, we don't measure it by, you know, you don't have to build a farm. I tell people that all the time. You don't have to be me or Joyal, who's equally decorated. You don't have to do those things. Sometimes those are just too big. Honestly, Joyal, I don't know how it got this big. Had I known in the beginning, it sort of took on a life of its own. Had I known, I might have been too scared to continue. It might have been like, I can't do this. It was just sort of baby steps all along the way. There was no master plan.
Yeah.
It just unfolded. And so I think, for me anyway, it was just these little tiny things that I did along the path that all built up, and then there was more need, and I was like, well, yeah. I mean, was it like that for you? I mean, I know you went right into DC, but in terms of the advocacy stuff?
Well, I mean, yes and no. I mean, actually, I spent the first 6 years staying in people's homes. I was invited to their food shelters, and people across I started meeting with people in DC in food shelters and police stations, and then it evolved to people across the country inviting me into their homes, people who were on public assistance programs, and we'd spend the weekend going to different things looking for food, people who were formerly incarcerated, people who didn't look like me or didn't vote like me sometimes, people who had just different life experiences began, they shared some of their most vulnerable moments. And because I'm a scientist, I was, listening to the stories, but I was also reading the quantitative data. And that's when I began to put this together. So it wasn't until year 7 that I started knocking on the doors of Congress saying, I think we have a big problem here that we're not doing anything about. And similar to you, it has kind of snowballed. For some people in my network, they know I started only with bereaved parents. That was my focus. That was my lived experience. That's what I knew. I got phone calls from other people in the bereavement and grief community saying, how could you not focus on bereaved children? How could you not focus on bereaved siblings? And I'm already boiling the ocean. Holy Toledo, I can't do that. And it probably took about a year and a half of me talking to myself, saying like, well, if you're really going to do this, you kind of have to step up. And so it's evolved to this place. It's not where it started. I had no grand idea or master plan. In fact, most of the time I like to sit and listen to other people lead. I don't necessarily feel a compunction to move, to move into a leadership position, except when I feel that there's a lack of inaction or an inattention to the personal story and the experience. And so many people have trusted me with their stories that now I feel a sense of not just conviction, but responsibility to continue to sort of lead this work forward. I also feel, though, I just want to say in the same breath, that at some point I shouldn't be leading this work anymore. And there should be lots of other people. There should be lots of other Joyals and Joannes and Andys and Myras in the world who are becoming the voices and redesigning what the experience looks like, so that those who have had profoundly compassionate experiences are the rule and not the exception.
Yeah. I love the way you said that. Yeah, absolutely. We've talked about that at length, right, Joyal?
Yeah.
Bringing up the next generation. We need the next generation to come up, get their voices activated, and sort of take over, because we're not getting any younger, are we?
Well, you're amazing.
No, no,
How do
no.
you know? I guess, how do you know? I'm just still thinking about these very tender times, and how do you know when to move? Sort of in the theme of sort of movement. And I will also just say my bias, I'm okay if you don't move for a while. Like I usually, when I'm talking to a newly bereaved parent, I just say like, your job is to survive. Try to keep breathing and just do your best. And anyone who comes with a very specific plan, I usually say, like, I'm not really in for absolutes. This is such a highly individualized experience. So But how do you, I mean, you're really the expert on the, you know, interfacing and interacting and supporting bereaved parents, specifically, I would say bereaved people generally, but, you know, in this context, bereaved parents. How do you know, or how do you find the motivation or the gumption to move?
That small, sweet step. Yeah, I mean, sometimes people get in contact with that still voice in them. Sometimes it takes some talking through, like sometimes it takes some narration, right? Sometimes it helps to have a trusted therapist, counselor, best friend, spiritual leader, animal to talk to process some of the stuff, to say, I think it's time. Um, I mean, one of the things that saddens me is if people activate a little bit sooner than perhaps they have the inner resources to activate, and that can create for some people some trouble later, because action can also be a bypass around grief, right? So the Sella model is built on this concept of being with grief, surrendering to grief, and then eventually doing with grief. But the doing with grief has to come from the being with grief, right? So emotion literally means in motion. The root word means to move through. And so we stay with our emotions long enough, and we get in contact with that still small voice in us that says, I'm being moved to do this. Let me sit with it for a couple of weeks or months and see what this could look like, and talk with trusted people and see how it feels after a few weeks or months. Um, it, I mean, I don't think that's really not exactly the way it happened for me. And I think, sort of to your point, Joyal, there was such a gap. There was nothing there for me when Shai died. And I was so desperate for help. And I was calling disconnected phone numbers. This is back when the yellow pages was a thing. And I thought, this is nuts. How do we not have a program for people who are grieving excuse me, sorry. How do we not have a program for people who are grieving the death of a child? And then all of a sudden I said, well, I have to do something. And I think that's what it sounds like for you, Joyal. You saw the gap. So if the gap moves you, then just be prudent about planning. Just don't do it too soon, perhaps. Make sure that the doing with comes from the being with, not as an avoidance of, but as a means to really truly fully inhabit your grief, because this is their energy in the world, isn't it? The work that you do is Eleanor's energy. The work that I do is Shai's energy. All of our beloved dead live through us in the ways that we remember them and honor them, whether it's mowing a neighbor's yard or paying for someone's tea behind us at the store, or whether it's running a huge advocacy group.
Yeah. How do you know when to tap out? Like, how do you know when you're moving and
Yeah.
yikes? Yeah.
That's a big question for both of us, isn't it? So I mean, there's the tapping out that happens at the micro level, right? Where we're like, I'm tired. I got to turn the computer off and go to bed, right? Because literally, I know you're like this too, Joya. We could work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Yeah.
I mean, there's unfortunately the world is hurting that much. So there's the micro tapping out where it's just like, I have to go to bed and recharge. But then there's the macro tapping out. Like, how do we know when it's time to transition our work to someone else? A secession plan. So I think for me, I'll talk about the micro tapping out. How I know generally is I'm really in contact with my body, and my body communicates it to me. I will start not feeling great. I don't really show it as much in my emotions. My emotions are pretty stable across the board, but I will start not feeling my wellness suffers. Let me just say that. I'll get headaches, my digestion gets off. I'm really feeling exhausted. I feel a little frenetic, maybe a little frenetic energy, so tired that I can't sleep. Once I reach that level, I know I've gone too far. How about you, Joya? When do you know when to tap out?
Well, I think from the early days are different than they are for me now. Very similar for today as for you. In the early days, I mean, I remember what I call sort of slipping, like regressing intentionally because I felt like I was also losing connection with my daughter.
Mm.
And if I could stay in bed longer, and I had to make these I just had to make the decision at some point, if I stay here, I'm going to continue to spiral, versus at what point did I decide, you know what, I can do this. Like I can go on the other side. And I think too, for me, for parenting, and I think this is a societal misconception. Just because my daughter died didn't mean my maternalism died with it. So when she died and I had my other kids here, I felt torn between these two worlds of having to attend to both my current kiddos, but also trying to be a mother for the daughter I didn't know where she was or where I could find her. And um, for me, because I am a scientist. That's how I see the world. It's how I think. I found myself in nature and really looking at the stars a lot more because there's so much we don't know. And there was such comfort and almost connection. So those days when I couldn't get out of bed, if I could manage to muster to come out in the middle of the night and look at the stars and have this sense of there's so much about, the physics of the universe and all that, she might not actually be lost forever. These were the kinds of things that balanced me in the early days. Um, but I felt that there were moments I had to make a decision to just that I was going to do it. And it was not easy. And I'm not saying that it can be done by everyone. But I also know that staying in those moments felt very connected to my daughter. And yeah, and there's something so warm and wonderful about that.
Yeah. Yeah, there really is. I agree about the nature thing. That's where I feel her too.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's incredible. What about, have you thought about your life in 3 years or 5 years and what it would look like?
Um, I have every intention, my hope in the next couple of years is that I begin to recede into the shadows. I didn't I didn't intend to walk and found an organization that now is doing all this work, and I felt like there should be change, and it's been an honor to be, in solidarity with so many people. Um, but at some point, I want other voices and other people and other experiences to take pieces of the concrete we've poured, and that they're the leaders. They're the leaders in their communities. They're the leaders at the state or the national or the global level. And I begin to be a supportive force that help cultivate their voices and their ability to champion these issues. That's my hope. I think 3 years might be too aggressive and my board might, but 5 years, we really should be moving down that path. What about you?
Nothing yet. I don't have a secession plan yet. It's hard to find the kinds of people who want to work the kind of out,
Yeah, it's
110
a lot.
hours a week. Who wants to work 110 hours a week? So I don't have a succession plan yet, but soon I will hopefully have a succession plan. It's on our list of things to do.
Dr. Joe and Joyal, I could keep listening to you two, but I would love to take some questions from some of our
100%.
folks. So let me get to those. Um, I'll start with Anna's question. And this came up before when you, Joyal, shared this story. How do you respond in the moment when someone is cruel, calls you horrible things, or says something insensitive? Sometimes I feel so overwhelmed leaving the house because I brace myself for the worst and I am anxious about ways I need to respond to the world.
Yeah, I don't have brilliant answers for you. I mean, it was very painful. I, in those moments, didn't have the strength to respond. I mean, just going back to what I said earlier, I think just keep breathing and trying to get through the first few years was really my goal. Um, over time, and I mean this took many years, over time, I was able to have a place for her and a place for everyone else. And I don't know what the sequence of events were that I began to sort of push back on responses. You know, I even remember, and I'm sure this is true for many of on the call, getting the first coupon like almost a year after. You know, yeah, my kid, I don't need diapers anymore. My kid's not here. Like, why, you know, but starting to be able to sort of push back in these venues where these um, expectations and the rudeness. That being said, it's really hard to do. And I think if I would leave you with anything, I would say you need to be relentlessly patient with yourself and give yourself enormous grace in ways that probably feel very uncomfortable and you're probably not used to doing.
I would agree with that. The only thing I would add to that for me, and maybe this is just a characterological thing, is I really did say to people, it's not my truth. And those 3 words felt like a reclamation of my emotional experiences. I wasn't going to let anyone colonize my emotional experiences, and I wasn't going to let anybody walk on me. It took me a couple months to get there. But once I found that's not my truth. That's not my truth. I think there was one time I actually went a little bit deeper and I said, that's not my truth. And I really don't understand why you would say something like that to me. But also, I also gauged like the social setting, like in the grocery store, I'm not gonna, how important is this relationship to me? If it's an important relationship, then I might be willing to go a little bit deeper. If it's a superficial relationship, I just was able to push back. And like Joyal said, that's not everyone's character. Initially, it wasn't my character either, but I guess I got pushed a little too hard. And listen, this is the benefit of something like anger or rage. You just because you're angry or rageful doesn't mean you have to punch a wall. You can just stand up and say, that's not my truth. It's not okay for you to say that to me. If you value our relationship, you won't say that to me again. So I think everyone needs to find their comfort zone in that. I just want to kind of grant you permission to push back a little bit if you feel like you can.
Thank you both. This is a question from Wendy, and this relates to taboo deaths. My challenge is sharing my story of my loss of my son by suicide when I am in spaces where it is important that others know this about me. I often end up comforting the other person or deflecting their reaction. Is there a good way to share this part of my life in a way that is freeing?
Could I ask a clarifying question?
Sure.
The clarifying question is, what most often are you being met with? Other people crying or getting upset and you having to comfort them? Is that verbal? Is it nonverbal? I guess I'm wanting a little bit of clarity around that interaction, if I can get some.
Well, I've allowed for unmuting. If Wendy, if you are here and if you want to chime in, please do so.
Okay. Hi.
Hi.
It's both. It's verbal. It's people getting emotionally upset, especially other parents, other mothers. They start thinking about their own children. And then they want to give me a hug or they want to do something. And I feel like I don't want to have anything. And I don't want to respond to their grief over my grief.
Right. Because it feels, Wendy, first of all, I'm so sorry about your child. That's devastating. And also, it feels like they're centering their own needs over your own.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. It depends, Wendy, how bold are you?
I'm pretty bold.
I mean, it would be perfectly okay to say something like, I know this is going to be hard to hear. But I also think that I also feel that this is an important aspect of my identity. And so I'm going to share it with you. And I'm just going to ask that you be really mindful and heartful in your response. And remember that I'm a mom who's missing her child. And set them up for the disclosure. That's one way to handle it. There are multiple ways that you could handle it, but that's one way that you could handle it. You know, I do think people don't know how to regulate their own emotions because we don't teach emotional intelligence in school. And so if they have other children, they start to feel overwhelmed and, oh my God, you know, and it brings up all kinds of fear for them. And they expect the person who is the grieving person to tend to their needs. And I do think it's generally naughty behavior when you center your own needs over the person who's grieving.
Do you put your hand up?
Thank you.
Is that helpful at all for you, Wendy?
Yes, that's great.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that whole thing of how I introduce it will be very helpful.
Okay, good. Joyal, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I won't add to that. I think that's wonderful.
Okay.
So there's a question here about forgiveness. How do we forgive people who couldn't bear witness? My mother-in-law disappeared after my daughter died. This is Natalie, by the way, and then reappeared when we had a new baby. I have so little respect for her. She feels like a fair weather mother-in-law, but I know it isn't her fault. Now my anger just hurts me.
I'll just say that I felt like it reshifted. Eleanor's death shifted so many of my relationships in my life. You know, I'm not going to sort of add more to Wendy's question, but I will say I also feel like I'm not a shrinking violet. So I tend to just, and not that you are, Wendy, I'm a little bit more of that activist. And so, for me to be able to continue to have a constructive relationship, and there still are people in my orbit where we've had the conversation about, hey, this is what I needed and this is what didn't happen. And that, at least having that conversation and that in dialogue, and that's not just something I'm holding, but also having them hold it as well, has been helpful for me, or is helpful for me in the time, and has helped me reframe relationships. At the same time, you know, there are relationships that I have had to not continue having, and I recognize that might not be a luxury that you have. I'll kick it to Joanne.
Well, I'll share this with you. When my child died, my best friend had just had a baby, and she didn't even come to the funeral. We'd been best friends for a long time, and she couldn't come to the funeral. She didn't show up. And then I called her after the funeral because I was, 88 pounds and not functioning and couldn't swallow food. And I said, Kelly, help me. I can't do this. I can't do this. I'm not going to make it. And she never called me back. She didn't call me for 2 years. And so I'm very sad for you that your mother-in-law responded that way. And also I would assume this is an important relationship. And, the important relationships, it shouldn't have to be this way. Grieving people shouldn't be responsible for mending those important relationships. I don't know if she would be open to reading material. I doubt it based on what you've shared. But sometimes people do come around. I had a bereaved mom I worked with who lost a child, and her parents were not helpful for her. They were an older generation, where the older generation was, somebody dies, you pull yourself up by your bootstraps, put their stuff away in a trunk in the garage, don't talk about it. How'd that work out for you, right? And that's how they treated her. And they came around. It took them a long time, but they eventually came around. But they actually both parents recently died because they were elderly. But she she said that her parents, before they died, apologized to her and said, we're sorry, we didn't understand. So there's no easy answer for this, because we can't force people into feeling compassion and being able to bear witness to this. You just can't. I wish we could force people, but we can't. I think it's just a matter of how important is the relationship, and how do you work on that relationship, on mending that relationship. It's tough. This is why I said the social system really matters for grievers.
Yeah.
Dr. Joe and Joyal, there's a question about siblings from Kim. How do you deal with an adult child who hasn't grieved his sibling's death? My son was 11 when my daughter died. We were both at home when I found her. His personality changed, and 12 years later, he is still so cold. He takes his anger out on me and says the worst things. I don't know what to do, but just can't take the emotional abuse from the son I love more than anything else on the earth.
It's hard to answer that question without a full assessment, without talking to him. But what I will say, it sounds like he's in his early 20s. And so that may change as he gets into his later 20s. He's still young. And also, a house, when a child in the house dies, the house becomes a house of pain. Everyone is in pain. I don't know if he's open to counseling. I don't know if he's open, if he talks. There's too many things that I don't know about him to really answer that. But of course, this is your child, and probably the most important relationship in your world. And so I always encourage people to try to be patient. And I know it's hard. I had one of my oldest, I had 3 children at the time that Shai died. And my oldest one, he's 38, and he still doesn't talk about it. He doesn't like to talk about it. My second one talks about it all the time. And my third one doesn't talk about it. It was just, and so I get, I'm their mom too. So you would think they would learn how to have expressed themselves, because I'm very expressive. But I think, my older one's finally coming around a little bit, talking a little bit about it, but it was never aggressive or angry or abusive or anything like that. Just didn't talk about his feelings, sort of a suppressor. And so I just give them space and time. I don't know, Joyal, what about for you and your other children?
My circumstances were different. My girls were younger. And there were certainly things at that time, and it took years for us to sort of peel the onion back. But I think going back to something from earlier in the conversation, all of our relationships with the people that we love and our children are individual and they're unique. And with grief, applying some algorithm or some checklist on like, this is the way it should, it's our tendency, because that's how we do so many things in our culture. But I think in this, it doesn't really apply. There are so many nuances to the relationship, to the circumstance, to so many things. I don't feel that I could possibly lend salient advice or any kind of advice without a broader understanding, and also not wanting to sound prescriptive or absolute, because I just don't think in this issue you can do that, or you can do that well.
I can add just real briefly. He is almost 23. And he was a very happy-go-lucky kid, and his sister was his hero. There was 8 years difference. And he just literally, I saw his face change that day. He just, he's so cold, won't talk about her, and says that if I talk about her, he's never going to talk to me again, and literally says the worst things anybody could even imagine, but only to me.
Yeah.
So I'm stuck with, how do I set my boundaries and tell my kid, you can't, I do tell him you can't say that stuff to me, and he still does. Or just let him be and hopefully process on his own. But it's tough because as a parent, you want to help your other children through this. I mean, he spent 4 days in an inpatient mental health facility because he wanted to kill himself when he was 20. So I know he's got the pain, but I feel like if I walk away from him, I might lose him too.
Yeah, I hear that.
Yeah, absolutely. Very valid concern. I would, you know, my thing is to stay connected as much as you can. And if he's asking not to talk about her around him, you know, this is my style. And so you need to find what's right for your family. But I always respect what others ask of me when it comes to familial stuff and talking about our sister or daughter who died. The ones who don't seem to want to talk about it or have trouble talking about it, I just don't say much. If I do something to honor her at the holidays, I just do it quietly. And I just say this for your sister, and then I leave it. So it's tough. It sounds really, really tough. And it sounds like you could use some good support. So please do look at, maybe after the call, after the series, look at some resources that we have available for you and your family.
Definitely.
Joyal and Dr. Joe, we have time for just one more question. Something came in about you, Dr. Joe, and your practice of Zen Buddhism. You are a priest, and it just made me think about what you mentioned earlier about post-traumatic growth, that part of that growth is spiritual growth. And we're also interested in creative growth as well. Maybe the two of you can share a bit about some personal examples for you of spiritual or creative growth that came about for you in the years following the deaths of your daughters.
Sure. Joyal, you want to start?
Sure. That's a tough one. So one of the things for me in the early days, I had to find my boundaries and the guardrails, the things that would send me slipping. This was one of them. I did not find solace in any traditional religious or spiritual environment. I found more solace in nature. And again, going back to the questions that I couldn't answer gave me comfort in the potential that everything was not lost. I have spent, so I guess to that end, I will just say, I probably spend more time than the average person thinking about planetary science and the universe. And now I have a little guy, a 10-year-old in our household who is equally interested in the universe and questions. And so when we're walking home from school or something, I have the luxury and the privilege of having that opportunity. And I'll be honest, that has helped me not be so angry and bitter and exist in the world. If I didn't have that, it would be very hard for me. And I certainly have my other kiddos who helped and who are just amazing and lovely and so forth. But having, someone else who is close to me to sort of explore those questions and connections, and he never meeting our daughter, but also sort of exploring some of those cosmic questions, if you will, has been something, if you will, on a spiritual growth side. I don't know that that quite answers your question, Andy. Joanne, I'm sorry.
No, I think it answered the question. Carl Sagan would say it answered the question. For me, my growth has really come through cultivating a practice. And so it's not necessarily religiosity as much as it is just cultivating a practice of being with what is without needing to change it. So I have a very, very prescriptive, list of 12 things that are my go-to things. I barefoot hike. I rescue animals. I practice ahimsa. Ahimsa is at the center of my practice. And so for me, it's having a very clearly defined practice for me to work with what it means to be a human being in this world, in this moment, who misses her child. And that means every moment of my life. So so my spiritual practice is that I have an intentional practice that I go to every day. And so I'm always really helping our clients or patients find their practice and define their practice, because that's spirituality. What you were talking about, Joyal, going out and looking at the stars, that's spirituality right there. You know, looking at a tree, saving an animal, that's the real deal right there. So if you ask me.
Yeah.
Dr. Joyal, thank you so much. The two of you, I know, have to go now. Everyone else, you are invited to stay for our breakout rooms. Please stay if you can. I'll be sharing a bit about that, but first let's show a little love to Joyal, to Joanne, to Shai and Eleonora, please.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. All
Yeah.
of our love to everyone who came, and deepest compassion.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Eleonora and Joya.